Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to welcome you to our webinar today. Today, our Pest Profile series continues, and today we're talking about the feral pigeon. Now, pigeons, for me, are one of the more fascinating birds that we actually get to work with. It's interesting, when we just go through our discussion today, we often refer to pigeons as obviously being not smart birds, in fact, quite dumb and docile looking. But the interesting thing is when we look at some of the interesting facts about pigeons, they're one of the more intelligent bird species that we get to deal with. So as our discussion sits today, I use the same discussion points with all of our pests, whether we're talking about avian pests or insect pests. So our discussion point today, I'm just going to let some more people in. Our discussion point today will start with the naming and identification of the species, its pest status, the legal regulations and restrictions around each individual species. Then we'll look at distribution, behaviour, the activity of this bird as a pest species, and then I'll try and spend as much time on management aspects of this bird as I possibly can. All right. G'day, Craig. I'm just going to stop your video. Okay. And so let's move on. So the feral pigeon, I just do this snapshot to start with as a real brief introduction, and I'm just going to pick a few interesting elements out of that. So the one thing I find really interesting about all the pest birds is birds in captivity have quite a long lifespan, but in the pest environment, many birds, and particularly pigeons, live for very short periods of time. You know, a three to 4 years is a fairly typical life expectancy of pigeons in the wild, in the pest environment. So if you think about the pest, where are we? Oh, just stop that. Think about the feral pigeons. They're having to work really hard to find food on a daily basis. So they'll have competition to food, but they'll have their place that they prefer to go to, and obviously they're very maternal to their roost. So even though that they're going back to that roost on a daily basis, there is still competition, and that really shortens the lifespan of these birds. I think it's stress and availability of food and water in a lot of cases. These are a ground feeding bird. I don't know why everyone's not coming in automatically. Ask all to unmute. Yeah. Hey, Brad, how you doing? I'll stop your video. For obvious reasons, ground feeding, seed eating bird. What I also find really interesting about pigeons, that we'll get to a little bit, apart from being extremely intelligent and maternal, the parents, when they're looking after the young or the squabs, they take about 28 days to fledge, which is actually a long period of time for these birds to spend in the nests. And often, obviously, there's a lot of discussion as why don't you see baby pigeons? And the interesting thing is the pigeons, for the size of the bird, they stay in the nest for quite some time in order to be able to fend for themselves almost immediately upon fledging the nest. All right, so from a common name perspective, we just refer to these birds as the pigeon. We also know them as the common or the feral pigeon. Now, these are domesticated descendants of the rock dove or the rock pigeon, which is Columba livia. So technically, while we're talking about the feral pigeon, it's a domesticated version of the wild species. So this would be Columba livia domestica. And so while they just belong to a family grouping of pigeons and doves. Now, the interesting thing is looking at the natural habitat of the blue rock dove, which is the wild species that is in the cliffs of both Scotland and Northern Ireland. There are still wild populations of these birds that have now obviously populated the world. So how have they populated the world? Well, I guess with messenger or carrier pigeons over millennia, but also being used as racing pigeons. They've literally populated the world. But when we look at the natural species, hang on a sec. I've just realized that I'm talking about this screen and I'm not even sharing the screen. This is what happens, people, when I go and take a month off. All right. I wish you'd all had told me this. That's quite interesting. All right, now, Mark, I think you're still sharing the screen. Anyway, all right. So all of a sudden, this has gotten hilarious. I do apologise. All right. So now, hopefully, you can see the screen. I've just gotten into this, and we need to really not start again. But here's the screen talking about the natural habitat of this cliff nesting species that we know as the rock dove, and of course we know as the pigeon. All right, now we're moving forward. Hopefully you can see this. Now, what I also will say is that for those of you who haven't actually been into my webinars, I literally just started and I just went straight into autopilot. So if you need to ask a question, there's a chat function, and also if you want to be unmuted and raise your hand, I will see that, but I would just prefer if you've got a question, just use the chat function and send me a text. All right, some of you could have said, by the way, you're not sharing the screen, but anyway, we'll move on from that. All right, so look, the interesting thing about the species identification of pigeons is, of course, we all know them. We see them literally on a daily basis. And what is interesting, the only argument that we would have about pigeons is, of course, that pigeons generally are considered a monomorphic species. Male and female look the same. It is possible, if you wanted to call them dimorphic, to say the males are bigger than females, but essentially in a pest environment, we're looking at a species that essentially looks the same, male or female. The only way you'll be able to tell the difference generally between male and female easily is that males will be tending to the nest in the mornings, and then the females will be tending to the nest or the young in the afternoon or the evening. There you go. Or of course, the one on top is the male. The one on below, for those of you needing a biology lesson, is the female. Because the interesting thing is, what we do know is we've got a highly fecund species, which I'll explain what that means shortly for those that don't know. But the idea is that this is a bird species that are inhabiting our towns and cities all across Australia, and sufficient food, water and shelter and living in our built environment has created obviously monumental flocks of these birds around the country. So the interesting thing is there are no real similar species to the rock dove or the pigeons or the feral pigeon. So the interesting thing is a lot of the bird species that we've talked about during the last couple of weeks, there are many similar species, and it's important to get the right identification. But when we're dealing with pigeons, there's generally no confusion. On the top left, we have the passenger pigeon, which is extinct and obviously not found in Australia. But on the right-hand side, we have a spotted turtle dove, but realistically, there are no similar species here in the country. So pigeons, of course, are a significant pest. In fact, I would say that they're probably Australia's most significant avian pest, and of course, the world's most prolific pest bird species. For Australia, of course, they're an exotic bird species. So therefore, when we look at legal restrictions, and many of the birds that I've spoken about prior to today have been native species, well, obviously being an exotic pest bird species, they're not protected in Australia, and they can't be re-released in Australia, which would also be considered illegal. But the birds, the nests, the eggs can be controlled or managed. The one priority that you would need to consider is observing animal welfare considerations for lethal control, because of course RSPCA and government bodies will be heavily involved in how we manage the control of vertebrate pests. We'll also look at legal restrictions when we're talking about trapping. So obviously traps would need to be checked on a 24-hour basis. You could do that in person or electronically with monitoring systems. But where you would need to consult local authorities would be using avicides or shooting. And of course, with shooting, it'd be more about populous permits and the like. But from a distribution perspective, well, we've got a bird that's pretty much inhabiting just about every town, city, and major centre within Australia. So they are literally right across the country. So distribution-wise, they are one of our most prolific pests. And while they're traditionally restricted to city, towns and urban areas, but also farm areas where, of course, there's abundant grain, we are talking about a bird that congregates and nests in the built environment. So they are literally looking for, obviously, enclosed areas in which to nest, but they will nest directly also on ledges. but as architectural features that they recognise as the locations of which to live within. So that could be bridges, schools, homes, or whatever. They also congregate in large flocks, and those large flocks would be considered family groupings or extended family groupings. So an extremely maternal bird that will literally want to continue to nest and roost in the areas that they were born. From a pest bird perspective, obviously they're impacting, tourism areas, parks, watercourses, stadiums, industrial areas, and of course homes. With the impact or the introduction of solar panels on so many homes, we're seeing this bird becoming a significant pest of suburbia as well. So just before we get on to some of the nitty-gritty, let's look at some fun facts. There are about 400 million pigeons worldwide. They can see up to 40 kilometres. They have a hearing frequency lower than humans, so they have the ability to predict the onset of bad weather. There is some that say that the use of high frequencies is irritating to the bird. From a pest professional's perspective, I just haven't seen that. In fact, if anything, when I see ultrasonic devices, I still associate that to areas with pest birds. They're an incredibly intelligent bird, and it's interesting because they look dumb. We consider them to be dumb, but they are very intelligent birds. And so working with them, you literally need to refocus and work out how, obviously, not to think like a pigeon, but understand that this is a maternal species, an intelligent species, and so on. Just interestingly enough, they're one of only 6 non-mammalian animals that can recognize themselves in a mirror test. They can recognize letters, but from a pest bird perspective, they can recognize architectural features and locations and go back to that nest and roost with great ease. They have incredible navigational abilities. They're highly social. They live in flocks, which are, as I mentioned earlier, are extended family. They are diurnal, which means that they have a very distinct day and nighttime activity. And then during the day, they're very active, foraging for food, digesting food, sitting in sunlight and so on, resting, communicating, and sitting in family groups and so on. And then, of course, they have nighttime activity, which is their roost and sleep, which makes them diurnal. They return to the same roost every night. That also is a stressful environment, so that's hence the reason why many of them are short-lived. They not only roost maternally, they nest maternally. So they'll want to actually have their roost close to their birthplace. They have a fast flying bird, so they'll fly at 125 kilometres an hour with a top speed of 150, and they've got the ability to return home from about 1,500 kilometres, which is quite impressive. Historically, they've had a long and strong association with man that goes back to 3000 BC. So the areas in which we know as Iraq, man and pigeons were used for food, and obviously in the 5th century, they were starting to be used as messenger pigeons, so carrying messages between townships and cities. In world wars, they carried up to 10% of their body weight. You often see photographs of pigeons with cameras or the ability to, carry messages across countries. From a global perspective, pigeons have been used in all the British colonies, obviously in Australia. They are used as racing pigeons. I actually found this interesting thing that obviously the Chinese community find not only the birds good luck, but there's a status symbol in China to be racing pigeons. And last year, a racing pigeon sold for $1.9 million. Must have been a pretty impressive bird, one would think. But prior to that, there'd been numerous examples of birds sold in the hundreds of thousands and millions. It's hard to believe. Anyway, I know that when you're trapping pigeons or working with pigeons, you see a lot of escaped racing pigeons. And of course, that is the global pigeon population is a combination of obviously birds that have colonized those areas, but moved around through racing pigeons and home and messaging pigeons and so on. All right, so from a behavioural perspective, they will congregate. What a handsome pigeon that is. Wow. But they'll congregate in flocks, which are family groupings. They'll nest in the built environment. They prefer to nest in enclosed areas, but it's interesting. You'll often see pigeons just nesting directly on ledges or in gutters, exposed roofs, and so on. Okay, so as I mentioned the term before, they are a highly fecund species, which basically means they're a very high survivorship of young and a high number of broods per year, a extended fledging period. But the idea is that when these birds fledge, they're independent of their parents. When you look at some species of similar age, like ravens or cockatoos and other parrots, the parents continue to tend to those birds for some weeks and sometimes months, whereas with pigeons, they return to nesting almost immediately. So again, fecundity is a term relating to the survivorship, which essentially relates to the success and therefore its ability of being a pest. So nesting, what's really interesting too is these birds are monogamous breeders. So they will mate for life. You often see a lot of non-monogamous behaviour when you're looking at a group of pigeons, but once they actually mate, they will tend to mate for life. They're very maternal, and both the male and the female will tend to the construction of the nest, the egg incubation, caring and raising the young. Both the male and female can actually produce pigeon milk. So that's from the crop, which is essentially the crop is the beginning of the stomach where food sits, and the stomach lining of both the male and female secretes this pigeon milk. So it's interesting. So the birds are raised in the nest for a 6 to 8 week period and essentially leave the nest fully grown and ready to begin an independent life. What's usual for pigeons too is that the parents will then start depositing eggs almost immediately, and they'll just keep building nest upon nest upon nest. So pigeons being maternal, not just to each other, but also to the actual nest itself. And that's why as a bird professional or a bird manager, you need to understand that element, is that the commitment that these birds have to their nesting location is incredibly strong. Just to put bird spikes on an area that had nests will just basically create a platform for those birds to build their next nest, because that's the behavior that they're used to working with. And that's important for later in our discussion. As I said earlier, they're a ground feeding nest eater. They're also considered omnivorous, and certainly in the wild, they are an omnivorous bird, but essentially what we'll see here on the right is essentially a bird that will just feed on the ground, and they'll just feed whatever's available to them. Impacts as a pest species. Now, the interesting thing is when you just jump into Google and you go to all these pest control or bird control equipment suppliers, they say, you know, birds spread 60 different diseases and so on. The interesting thing is pigeons are very clean. They live in an unsanitary environment, but they keep themselves very clean. Where we find that the birds can potentially carry disease is really just the fact that their droppings tend to be in an unsanitary, that create an unsanitary environment, particularly as this photograph here shows, you know, an air conditioner condenser in a confined space, and it's just drawing in the particulate process of the droppings. And of course, contact with the droppings can impact humans in certain ways. Now, all these websites will say, oh, histoplasmosis. Well, there's no histoplasmosis in Australia. Cryptococcus and psittacosis, all of those generally are very rare, if not non-existent in Australia, psittacosis potentially. But the interesting thing is where you'll find the impact to bird professionals. And so I guess the group of people that we have here, you'll have impacts with the respiratory system. So it's the particles of dried droppings that's disturbed, the spores and the fungus within that. There's impacts to the lungs, be it chlamydiosis, or another version or allergy is known as pigeon fanciers or bird fanciers lung. And so that's the impact that this bird droppings will have on the human respiratory system. From a food safety and a direct contact with food, that would be also the major issue in our clients' commercial facilities. So E. coli and salmonella being the main infections that we would see from a food safety perspective. So the human risks that we see, most of us are working with pigeons up on roofs or on ledges and so on. And so when we see air intakes into a facility just covered in bird droppings. Of course, you'll see that the air conditioning guys won't repair this particular area because it's unsafe, but it's also quite unsafe for the air being drawn into the facility because it's taking in the bacteria and spores that are sitting in that disturbed material. But of course, from a car's perspective, well, that's not ideal. And the bottom right-hand photo is a photo I took just of just the amount of bird dropping that will just accumulate in areas. Other areas, all of which I've worked in here, rail areas on pallets and so on, and carcasses and bird droppings littering the rooftops of a lot of the facilities. From a management perspective, which is the area that we all want to get involved in ourselves, the one thing I can get across to you about pigeons is they're extremely maternal, but they're very much committed to the areas where they're nesting and roosting, and they'll return to that always on a daily basis. And so no matter what system you put in place, you know that when it comes to pigeons, it's going to be under some level of pressure. Now, be it a light, medium or heavy pressure, but when it's nesting and roosting, it's going to be extreme pressure. So hence we're going to look at exclusion or netting as our first point of call. Bird spikes, we need to be aware that if the birds are nesting and roosting, they will be ineffective. And so while I often hear the term, bird spikes fail with pigeons, what I find is it's that bird professionals fail with pigeons because of the incorrect use of product. So we're going to look at a whole bunch of systems and products. But bird shock and spikes can be effective when it comes to non-nesting areas. I'm not a big believer of sound systems when it comes to pigeons. I haven't seen any good advancements in sound systems, and I haven't seen great anecdotal evidence of birds being deterred. We do see reasonable deterrence when we're using like visual deterrence, obviously eagle eye, but there are lasers and other things that you can actually use to deter birds in flight, and that can create sort of a safe zone around buildings. But we'll obviously focus on buildings as well. One of the things that we often overlook when it comes to pigeons is the original IPM approach, integrated pest management. So we need to look at modifying the building or modifying cultural elements, the food, the water, and obviously access to rubbish bins, improving sanitation, and overall considering a range of different management systems, not just throwing bird spikes around and simple processes. We actually have to look at pigeons just like we would look with termites or other pest species, where we need to actually go through a number of stages. All right, now this is a photograph that was just sent to me 2 days ago, and I just wanted to actually share this with you. So the interesting thing is a client has got a heritage site, but we've got fairly extreme situations. Here we've got years and years of build-up of bird droppings. So I'm going to actually have a closer look. That's a better photo. So here we've got birds nesting on the corbels and the ledges of this building. Now, of course, in a lot of cases, that's a really difficult situation in which to get some level of control. What would be great is actually we could create like a bird slip or bird slope. We make that here now, and we could use that. But of course, we couldn't use that in a heritage environment. So that really creates a number of challenges. One, if we use bird spikes here, we know that this will fail. These birds will just continue to nest and roost directly on the nests that they've had in years gone by. Just because we put bird spikes on there, they'll just continue to bring more nesting material onto the bird spikes, create a platform and continue on, because that's their natural behavior. Okay, so what to do here? I just came up with a bit of a plan, and if I had the option, I would use bird shock. So bird shock is where we've got a high voltage system, which we'll come and have a look at in a moment, but obviously removing the nesting material, removing the years of bird droppings that are built up from the upper ledges to the lower ledge. You can see the triangles in the top right-hand corner there. That's eagle eye, and I would just sort of use eagle eyes there to try and create some deterrence, but that might require me to trim the trees. But I think all of those would be useless if I didn't put in a trapping process. Now we've got populated area, we probably couldn't shoot or use poisons. So trapping up on the roof would probably be the first and most important thing to do in this situation. When you've got birds that are so committed, and we've probably got 10 or 12 birds that are just living on that front facade and probably have done for years. And there'll be generations living on that particular area. And so I'd be looking at trapping first, cleaning, and eagle eye ledge deterrence, and trimming that tree. The reason I trim the tree is just so I can give some greater area for the eagle eyes to actually get some level of deterrence out in that airspace around the building. So a couple of those systems we just talked about. Bird shot. Whenever you electrify anything, humans, animals, or birds, you get a very strong response from what you're trying to. And if you've ever shocked yourself using bird shock, you'll understand why. But, you know, there's no impact to the bird. It's just teaching that bird to stay away. So when we've got nice wide parapets like this, instead of using 4 or 5 rows of bird spikes, which would also look ugly, bird shock will just give you a 6 or 7 millimeter profile, but a very strong deterrence. And I can use the various colors in which to link in with the color of the facade. But nice thing is, it's generally an invisible product from below your eye line. So there's the product in use on this particular front facade or this parapet. And here it is, just in some jobs that I was helping a pest manager with in central Queensland. So again, nice wide ledges. So the first thing that the bird lands on is generally the inside edge of the parapet or the outside edge of the facade. And so strategically placed bird shock generally will remove birds from not just the parapet, but also from a greater area of the roof, because they'll generally be using the parapet to alight or fly off from. And that, in conjunction with eagle eyes on this particular job, was very, very useful. Another example of just putting enough bird shock in place where you'd normally have 2 or 3 rows of bird spikes, but would just give a stronger message to the birds to stay off that parapet. So I just want to actually show you about a job that I helped a client with in Hurstville in Sydney many years ago. And so he called me out and we did this job together, actually from ladders. I don't work from ladders very much, and this is 10 years ago. But the idea is, he said, come and have a look at this. We're going to put bird shock and spikes on this. So this is a Hurstville rail station. And so what we did is we put 2 rows of bird shock, and then we had we actually put 1 row of bird spikes. And this is actually us, it's the ladder upwards in a public space. I don't know that you do that these days, but whatever happened 10 years ago happened 10 years ago. And so there we see at the bottom left, you'll see a little sign to say, don't touch. And it's linked up to a little solar panel, and that's just our tools and bits and pieces up the top left. But essentially, this is straight after we turned the job on. I wish I'd videoed it, but basically we had 200 pigeons that as soon as we switched it on, they all went across the road. And of course, if you were to go across the road and let those building people know, that would be the example of going from bird manager into salesperson mode. But it was interesting. That was a very strong and very quick result. And that bird shot stayed in place for many, many years. We actually went back to do a service on it some years later, but it's still operating. Bird shot can also be used in conjunction with bird netting. So here's an 11th level building that had pigeons all the way down all 11 levels and impacting the cappuccino bar down the bottom. So rather than have abseilers go all the way down all 4 internal aspects of the light well, we just net it across the top, and then we use bird shock around the outside edge to stop the birds from defecating either side of that internal parapet. But from a light well perspective, the use of bird shock and the bird netting was highly effective. You'll notice some black lines going across. Well, that was where we're able to put zippers to allow rope access for those going down into that for annual cleanings instead of quarterly cleaning. So that was a great result, that one. Bird shock used all over Australia. We introduced, Pest IT introduced the use of bird shock systems back in 2004, 2006. Easy to install, and many of you that are watching today have used the product, but great when you need that extra level of deterrence with a bird that is highly committed to the roosts or the areas that they're returning to. Bird spikes, well, I've probably been a bit negative on bird spikes when it comes to pigeons, particularly when they're nesting, but in light pressure situations where you've got full exposed parapets or ledges, bird spikes can give you some edge protection to stop you from seeing the bird defecating over the front of a facade. But again, wherever there's any sort of protection over the top, I would be removing the use of bird spikes because there's that potential for birds such as pigeons to continue nesting. But anyway, just from a bird spike perspective, here you can see you've got the narrow bird spike that you'd use on RSJs. I'm looking up at my warehouse roof here, but we've got RSJs above my head, and that's the example where I'd use a narrow spike, wide being great for just narrower ledges, and then the extra wide on your nice wide parapets. And the other gutter spikes that we've just now released. So the spikes can now just be used quite easily in gutters, and that again will just give you edge protection and stop pigeons from nesting in gutters. But generally, I would just use it as an edge protection type process. So here are classic examples of where we've used spikes for pigeons. So just on the pipework there, or on the edges of gutters, or on parapets, nice open exposed areas. All of these instances were areas where we know that the birds weren't nesting. Otherwise, the pigeons would continue to nest directly onto the spikes. And so a classic example of pigeons nesting on spike, I had to get this one from Google because I know I've got photographs of birds on spikes, but seagulls and pigeons, but pigeons just have that behavior to continue nesting directly on top of nests, on top of nests, on top of nests. And you'll have generational nests just sitting there like this one. So if to put spikes on an area where the pigeons have nested, you know full well that without constant removal of the nesting material, they will just eventually create a platform such as this. So when I look at industrial situations, and here's an example of a post-delivery distribution centre. This is in Tamworth. I remember going up and training a team. This is an example where for pigeons, in this case, and as well in starlings as well in this particular building, we're going to use bird net. And of course, here's an example of bird net just going in, and by creating essentially a false ceiling, fully enclosing that, you're removing all the abilities for the birds to sit above loading docks, and this is actually netted on the inside of the building as well. So from a perspective, I'm just going to show you a bunch of installations. It's hard to obviously show all the different installations and so on, but here from left to right, we've got cable running down the full length of this building, and an entire ceiling of bird netting is put in place. From memory, this is about 180 metres long by 25 metres wide. This is a job that I trained a team in Auckland, but the idea is that bird netting, by removing the bird's access to the roost, is the only way that you're going to succeed, particularly when the birds are going into a breezeway like this and then turning left or right, depending on how you're looking at it, and going into the warehouse itself. So protecting a loading dock is the first point of call needed in a lot of these industrial situations. So some of these buildings are brand new buildings. In fact, the last building was just a refurbishment. This one was a brand new distribution centre. And so here we can see, I don't know whether you can actually see the mouse, but over the left-hand side, you can see the net line, and then the cable just follows the beams. And this was actually a 17,000 square metre job done over a 9-week period. And so it's really exciting to be doing large projects like this in a pre-construction perspective. But again, all of these are ways to stop the pigeons from incursion into a building. They can still fly through open doors, but the best way to stop them is to actually start with areas of a loading dock to try and reduce the impacts of birds coming inside. And again, left or right here is a Shepparton project that Josh was training a team on. And so again, loading docks will be a fairly simple but substantial process in which to do the netting to remove birds' access to their roost. It's a job actually I photographed only 2 weeks ago, and this is a classic example where I just suggest to people the simplest way to get your netting underway is just by netting kits. So we create 10 by 10 netting kits, 10 by 20, 20 by 20, and so on, where basically we just supply you a whole kit of material. So this was a 20 by 20 kit. And so the idea is the guy bought, the netted area for the top, and in the rear is also netted. And so we just supply a simple kit in which to get that done. So elevated netting is another form of netting. I'm going to show you a couple of different types of netting just now, but elevated netting, we have instances where we get extreme roosts on top of large buildings. And so while we do this for seagulls, this is also done quite regularly for pigeons. And so the idea is you're using, poles in 10 metre by 10 metre grids, and then running a 50 millimetre net or a 19 millimetre net over the top under tension. And so here's an example of a police station in rural Victoria that Josh did. This was for pigeons. And so they just literally had so many different elevations, so many courtyards, solar panels and different roof and architectural features. And it was just easy to net over the top. And so again, a modern building, so not heritage listed, but the idea is that that's a way of actually just creating a complete exclusion process. In fact, actually, there was a police minister was interviewed on TV the other night and actually used this as a backdrop. So I saw Josh's work on the TV and on the news the other night. So it was pretty cool. So again, left and right here, again, elevated netting. And as you can appreciate, when you've got extreme situations, pigeons nesting under these walkways, under these air conditioning units, in box gutters, and underneath behind the parapets, it's often an option to just net over the entire area. Again, has to be an extreme situation, large number of birds, and highly committed to a site of generations. But anyway, these are what is often done. Some other jobs that we've been involved in, training pest managers. This is one I did in Melbourne years ago. And so again, we've got multiple levels of pigeons nesting and roosting in an underground car park and in levels of all these different wide ledges. And the easiest option was to net over the top. And so we can basically see, this is the job in progress, still to come along here. But the idea is just a four-sided courtyard, easy process in which to net. Okay, sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated. This is a large courtyard. So this is a 30 metre by 30 metre, not a square area. And so the idea is this is an area that we bird netted, but had to use a multitude of cables to get enough netting across. And that was quite an interesting job. But again, what you're trying to achieve here is a seamless installation of stopping the birds from accessing the courtyard. But as you can see, if you were to try and use bird spikes and other systems on all the different pipe work below and ledges and windowsills and so on, it's such an easy process. And this actually led down to underground car parks and so on. So the use of courtyard netting was really useful. Now, the other element that you find is pigeons will often nest in open air conditioning plant rooms. This had seagulls and pigeons. And so again, when you've got air exchange with the building below, air exchange and all that particulate element of bacteria and funguses and aspects of bird droppings that's disturbed as it dries, that can be highly dangerous to the building occupants below. So this was just netted over the top. So this is the job underway. And then this is just the finished job. It's just a one-day job, cable around the top, netting under tension, and an easy installation. So from netting, we then move to other forms of exclusion. And so exclusion would also be one of the areas that's growing at the moment is the use of solar panels. In fact, 1 in every 5 homes has solar panels these days. And what we've seen is the pigeons have moved from the townships and the cities into suburbia, and you'll find homes with 10, 20, or even 40 pigeons nesting and roosting on a domestic roof. And so it's going to be detrimental to your guttering, to your water harvesting, to noise, the smell, and the life of the building construction and the building coatings and paintwork and so on. So the best way to do this is, of course, just a simple use of clips and solar exclusion mesh. We use a stainless steel mesh in our own clips. But what's really important is think about that maternal instinct that the bird has to its roost as well as its young. Those birds will continue to try and impact. In fact, actually, a couple of the guys that are here today have had impacts of pigeons hanging around roofs for weeks and months after an installation, particularly when you clean the solar panels, only to have the birds persist. And so what we need to do is, if you know that the birds are nesting, you'll need an additional form of deterrence. So one of the first installations I did using our own system, and this was in Melbourne, the 40-odd pigeons continued to persist for 2 winters after we'd completed the job. And so it was a good learning experience. Just meshing off the solar panels is not enough. You may have to do some other form of deterrent, and we'd look at visual deterrence and also trapping as an alternative. So just looking at how a solar panel exclusion, the interesting thing is it's probably the most popular search that brings people to our website. So, you know, obviously it's a growing area for you to consider in the domestic area of bird control, but also commercial. Here's an example of a commercial solar array. This particular one had about 1,200 solar panels that was done. So it's quite a fairly significant investment for the company, but hopefully a profitable process for you to get involved in. So again, here's an example on the left of it being done on tiled roof. And then sometimes you might find areas that are difficult to get to. So a client of ours just had laser light that they were trying to use a solar exclusion to, and couldn't actually walk on this particular area. So they ended up getting the larger version of our gutter brush and just stuff that in there. So gutter brush can be used as an alternative to mesh, but it's also great when you can't reach an area. And so we used brooms and so on to try and get it over the area that you couldn't reach. But again, in a commercial array, you know, that's a growing requirement of keeping pigeons off, you know, industrial roofs, car yards and the like. So here's an example of another large area just in southeast Queensland that was done a few years back. Sometimes you'll find though, just by meshing the birds out of the solar panels, or even just looking at ways that we would use physical deterrence on buildings, you may need to try and protect the airspace around a building. And that's where Eagle Eye as a visual deterrent can be quite useful. So Eagle Eye sends off flashes in all these different directions. It rotates 360 degrees, but it's only sending off the flashes at 300 to 310 degrees. So the idea of Eagle Eye is we use a couple of those together, but they can be quite useful in deterring birds from the airspace around a building. Of course, typically when you go and have a look at the system in place, you'll often see birds on a building around an Eagle Eye, but realistically what it's designed to do is, when it's installed correctly and in the right locations, to try and protect the airspace as birds are flashed as they approach a building. So you'll probably find that will only deter the birds in flight. It won't deter the birds if they're settled in or they can access the building from another direction. So it's one of those things that you need to actually look at a whole building approach. And in fact, I think on this particular hospital in the photo here, there was about 22 Eagle Eyes used in conjunction, and there has to be a line of sight between, you know, that building and the one on the right and one on the left and so on. It worked in conjunction with also the use of bird shock. And so bird shock was actually installed on all the roof pitches and also on the building edges. So Eagle Eye working in conjunction with bird shock on wide ledges and building edges. So when we look at Eagle Eye, here's an example of a building which we were just putting Eagle Eye on, and as an example also just meshing around the solar panels. So solar panels alone, just meshing is not enough generally, particularly when you have this many pigeons and the amount of bird droppings and so on this building. So we used a combination of just Eagle Eye wind-driven units and Eagle Eye solar, and the idea is rather than having to net over the entire area, but it did certainly keep them out of the congregating on the building facade. That was the main area. So again, examples of Eagle Eye being used in commercial situations. So again, the hospital on the left and a grain facility on the right, just used in conjunction with other systems. So another thing that you would actually look at using potentially around your solar panels is bird breezer. So bird breezer is a deterrent system that just blows in the wind, just like Eagle Eye does. It's made by the same people, but just sends out flashes over a 3 to 5 meter area. So lower cost, simple to install, and you can use it on either end of a solar array in conjunction with your solar exclusion systems. Other systems that you can use, like for platform protection and so on, to keep pigeons off areas, called daddy longlegs or huntsmen. But again, you're using a physical deterrent that can also act as a scare deterrent, because they revolve around in the wind. I mean, somebody got carried away on the left there and used that on that many on the roof area over the left. But sometimes physical installations not only are easy, but they can be useful for keeping birds off large areas. But primarily where you would use it, where the seagull is just on lighting and air conditioning systems. Now, just before we sort of finish off and look at population control, sometimes you find pigeons in an extreme situation. So here's an example where you've got air conditioning systems and a little roof area that was holding a population of about 30 or 40 pigeons. The smell, the mess, and the impact on this little area here, and the impact that it had on the officers looking over that, was significant. So here is a grid wire system which we electrified. So we call this AvPro ElectroBird. So it's only occasionally that we would use it, but I just thought I'd mention it because it's been used for seagulls and for pigeons. In this case for pigeons, so you can actually see we use the wires on the parapet there and the wires in a grid, and it's electrified, and any bird that goes in there is given a mild shock and it's time to leave. So in extreme situations, in this case, because it had a glass frontage, we couldn't net that area over. So that's just showing you an example of a product that can be quite useful in some situations. So there you go. And then you can use it also on different angles and have like an electrified perimeter around a building. So yeah. Now from a population perspective, well, obviously from the professionals that are here, you've obviously got three options when it comes to shooting, trapping and poisoning. I just want to talk about trapping because trapping can be really useful when it comes to pigeons. Pigeons, when we look at a lot of the instances in the examples that we've shown so far, population control can form a very important part of it, because you really have a bird that is very instinctively maternal to a location, and therefore removing that bird is probably the only way that the system that you put in place is going to succeed. So in a nest or a roof situation where it's a very heavy pressure process and the birds are very committed, sometimes the best way to start is removing that existing population and then putting your physical or scared or the exclusion systems in place to do the work. So we designed a pigeon trap years ago, which has been really popular. I just thought I'd show you this. So it's a great way, obviously, to knock your population down, reduce the impact of pressure on your system, and a simple way to obviously using food and water and shelter in which to collect your birds and obviously euthanizing them appropriately. So here's an example, some photos. This is the original version of the pigeon magnet. Now it's kind of like still quite large with a shelter, but quite squat more. This was just the original versions of it. But again, a really simple way of, reducing the number of birds. This building had a couple of traps just operating, and the guy just went up there. He'd take, you can just see here a 9-kilo CO2 bottle. So he rigged up a euthanizing process. And then we later developed a euthanizing bucket. And so the idea is that was an easier way to use gas rather than large industrial size. That was just a simple way for us to introduce a gassing process, but also cervical dislocation is also an appropriate means of control. So again, this is a really interesting one. A friend of mine up in Sutherland Shire, my own home base, he was having difficulty getting the pigeons into this trap. He had 80 pigeons in an office block. And I remember him ringing me with just such great joy. He says, I worked out how to get the birds in the trap. They weren't coming into the trap. They weren't coming to the food, but he knew that everyone in that building fed the birds. So what he did is he threw the seed into the trap, and immediately the birds flew down, went into the trap and started eating the seed. So it was really interesting. So he collected over a 2-day period the 80 pigeons, and then did whatever treatment process in terms of spikes and so on. But again, a happy customer by removing the birds. Healthy looking pigeons, you also see in a lot of these photographs, you'll always see a lot of leg rings, escaped racing pigeons, of course. So again, they're boosting up the health of the local population. Well, they were. So just finishing up, today we talked about pigeons. We could also talk for days and days about pigeons. There's so many interesting aspects of them, but they are intelligent species. There's not many similar species, so easy bird to identify. Some of the things that we talked about, apart from the fact that their impact on our commercial and domestic clients, impacts around health can be significant. But from a behavioural perspective, that's where we sort of need to just be aware that these birds are very maternal. They live in family groupings. They will want to nest and roost in the same locations. And I guess when we look at nests, building nest upon nest tells us why bird spikes, which is probably one of the fundamental things used for pigeons, can be problematic when the birds are nesting. So we need to think outside the square, incorporate a number of different solutions in which to reduce the impact of this bird on your clients' facilities. So I just want to say thanks for getting involved in our webinars.